MCU isn't perfect, mind, and a lot of its problems, at least in terms of storytelling, can come from trying to connect one too many jigsaw pieces to the bigger puzzle. There are plenty of times the MCU has left fans scratching their heads as to what they have just seen, even still years later. So with that in mind then, I'm Ellie with What Culture, and here are the 10 most confusing scenes in MCU history. Number 10. Gamora is chosen in What If? Like WandaVision, What If is the only other Disney Plus series from the MCU to date to feature 9 episodes. The first 8 each introduced a new universe and a new particular character, with the season finale bringing them all together to fight Ultron. The 9th episode opened with a montage of the Watcher choosing the likes of Captain Carter, Star-Lord and Thor, but he also chose a character not yet seen in the series. Gamora, survivor of Sakaar and destroyer of Thanos, along with a Tony Stark variant in painted Hulkbuster armor on Nidavellir, was also brought into the team. She was the only one of the Guardians of the Multiverse who hadn't had an entire episode dedicated to her universe and her story, and so when she was introduced alongside Tony in ridiculously different circumstances, there was clearly an explanation needed, but none given. In fairness, this was through no fault of Marvel. The worldwide pandemic affected the MCU just like everyone else on the planet, and time constraints forced an episode to be dropped from the season 1 slate. Gamora and Tony's story was supposed to be told before the season finale, but instead they seemingly came out of nowhere to the confusion of many fans watching. Number 9. The Infinity Pool in Avengers Age of Ultron. During the Avengers fight with Ultron for the fate of the world, Thor took a break from avenging to find Erik Selvig and go swimming. Of course, there was more to the scene than that, but in all honesty, not much more. It is the bare bones of a much larger intended scene that didn't make the final cut of the movie, meaning what we saw made little to no sense. This was where Thor found out about the Infinity Stones and got the idea to bring Vision to life, but there is absolutely no explanation as to what the pool is, why he saw what he saw, why it was so dangerous, and why he needed Selvig. All of these questions would have apparently been answered in the original scene, which was ultimately cut due to time constraints and poor reception from test audiences. What is surprising is that the scene which informed and sparked Thor's journey through Ragnarok and beyond was treated so poorly. This was an important scene both to the movie and to Thor himself, but in the version that was ultimately released in cinemas, it was a nonsensical detour that served only to confuse fans. Number 8. Stan Lee's time travel in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. One of the highlights of every MCU movie until the great man sadly passed away was the trademark Stan Lee cameo. From Iron Man through to Avengers Endgame, he appeared in every movie in some regard, and while each and every one was universally loved, there was one that left fans scratching their heads. There had long been theories about how he was able to show up in every single movie, and Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 tried to answer this question. He was seen on a planet talking to several Watchers, boasting about how one time he was a FedEx delivery driver. This would suggest that Stan Lee was in fact the same character throughout all of his cameos, and that he was there to observe like all Watchers do. However, this created a problem surrounding the MCU timeline. He referenced his time as a delivery driver, which was in 2016's Captain America Civil War, though while the movie may have been released before Guardians Volume 2, it was actually set 2 years after it. James Gunn's Guardians sequel was set only a few months after the events of the first movie, putting it firmly in 2014, 2 years before Stan Lee showed up as a delivery driver. The director has even since admitted it doesn't make sense within the MCU's timeline, but has tried to get out of it by saying the character could have worked for FedEx multiple times across his long life. Flimsy at best. Number 7. Thanos will do it himself in Avengers Age of Ultron. In the post-credit scene of The Avengers, Thanos made his MCU debut, relishing the thought of going to war with the humans after Loki's defeat. After another brief appearance in Guardians of the Galaxy, he returned in the Avengers Age of Ultron post-credit scene, though this one was far less straightforward. This time coming after Ultron's defeat at the hands of Earth's mightiest heroes rather than Loki's, Thanos seemingly for the first time took hold of the Infinity Gauntlet, claiming that he would have to do the job himself. There was a lot of confusion about this. First of all was the timing. Why now? Thanos had absolutely nothing to do with Ultron's attempts to destroy Earth. Earth, but the scene at the end of the credits and the character's phrasing seemed to suggest that the Mad Titan was reacting to the events of the movie. This made no sense. Surely the writers could have gone to further lengths to establish this as a completely separate scene from what audiences had just watched. Then there was the logistics of the gauntlet itself, something that had to be clarified by Kevin Feige himself due to the gauntlet previously making an Easter egg appearance in Thor. It turns out that there are two Infinity Gauntlets, and that the one seen in Odin's vault in 2011 was a fake, something that was confirmed by Hela in Ragnarok. This scene, along with the seemingly inconsequential Easter egg at the time, made for a lot of explaining for Marvel. Number 6. Bruce Banner remembers in Avengers Infinity War. For as long as Bruce Banner has been changing into the Incredible Hulk, he has essentially been living a double life. The huge green rage monster took over the wheel of Bruce's mind, and upon returning to his puny human form, he had no recollection of what had just happened. This was confirmed without debate in Thor Ragnarok. When Hulk piloted a Quinjet away from the battle with Ultron, it was the start of 2 solid Earth years without transforming back into Banner. When he finally did switch back, Bruce had no memory of anything. Despite it being 2 years ago, he thought they were still fighting Ultron. This all makes sense, but these rules were seemingly ignored at the beginning of Infinity War. At the end of Ragnarok, Bruce is on board the Asgardian ship in his Hulk form. The next time he is seen, he is getting his ass kicked by Thanos aboard the same ship, still in his Hulk form. While unconscious, he is sent back to Earth by Heimdall. Only once he crash lands in the Sanctum Sanctorum does he change back into his human form, but Bruce knows who Thanos is, knows he is coming, and is able to lecture Tony Stark and Stephen Strange about him. So, does Bruce know what's going on while he's Hulk or not? Number 5. Is Thanos an Eternal in Eternals? Thanos' part in the Marvel Cinematic Universe may have come and gone, but that doesn't mean his presence won't still be felt. He appeared in several episodes of What If, and was referenced during the post-credit scene of Eternals by his brother Eros. When Thena, Makari and Droog were searching for Cersei, Kingo and Phastos, they were joined on board the Domo by Star Fox, an Eternal claiming to be the brother of the Mad Titan. This raised so many questions that even those with knowledge of their complicated history in the comics would struggle to answer from an MCU perspective. They are brothers in the source material, though their wildly differing appearances can be explained by Thanos carrying the Deviant gene. However, Eternals in the MCU are slightly different. They are essentially synthetic robots created by the Celestials, in which case, how could any of them possibly have siblings? Does that make Thanos an Eternal and thus a robot too? Well, what was his story? How did he escape the clutches of the likes of Arishem? Even if you take Thanos carrying the Deviant gene as gospel and assume it translates into the MCU, there are inconsistencies. When Thanos snapped his fingers, he puts a significant hold on the birth of Tiamat by halving the Earth's population. The Eternals were told not to interfere with any conflicts unless directly involving deviants, but if Thanos is a deviant, why weren't the Eternals employed? So far, this post-credit scene has raised far more questions than answers. Number 4. 8 years later in Spider-Man Homecoming. Spider-Man's introduction had been a long time coming in the MCU, and after his debut in Captain America Civil War, the Webhead was finally getting his own franchise under the Marvel Studios banner. Excitement couldn't have been higher, but the movie arguably got off to the worst possible start. The opening scene showed the villain of the movie, Adrian Toomes, working with his crew to clean up the Chitauri mess in the wake of the Battle of New York. It was well established that this took place in 2012, the same year the Avengers was released, but then it got confusing. The next scene jumped to the present events of the movie, but the title card stated 8 years later. This would set Homecoming in 2020, 3 years in the future from when the movie was actually released. Immediately, audiences didn't know what to think. Surely this movie wasn't set in the future, but how could such a big error have made it into the final cut of the movie? Even Kevin Feige couldn't explain this away, but the Russo brothers have since confirmed that this was a mistake. Thanks to the events of the wider MCU, many involving Peter Parker, it would be physically impossible for Homecoming to take place 8 years after the Battle of New York. Number 3. ELECTRO'S multiversal appearance in Spider-Man No Way Home. No Way Home was one of the biggest movies in the history of the MCU, and even after the likes of the Avengers and Infinity War, the appearances of Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire made it the most ambitious too. The third in John Watts' trilogy was met with universal acclaim, even though it wasn't perfect. There was one detail in particular that broke the very rules set out in the movie itself. The spell cast by Doctor Strange opened the multiverse and drew in people from other universes who knew Spider-Man's true identity. This made sense for 4 out of the 5 villains of the piece, but not all of them. By the time The Amazing Spider-Man 2 concluded, Max Dillon was still in the dark as to who Spider-Man really was. This means that he should never have been brought over to the MCU in the first place. So how did he get there? It seems that this may have been an oversight by the writers of the movie, but they even included a scene where Max sees Peter without his mask and comments his surprise that he wasn't black. There are theories as to how he jumped universes, but nothing concrete, and nothing that was explained in the movie itself. Number 2. Hulk explains time travel in Avengers Endgame. Time travel can be a dangerous tool to use in storytelling, as it opens the door up to a plethora of potential plot holes, rule breaks, and things that simply don't make sense. The rules have to be clearly specified, and the theory behind them watertight. This is what was attempted in Avengers Endgame, but in all honesty, it essentially just confused issues further. Rhodey, Scott, and Clint believed time travel to be like in the movies. Back to the Future, among others, were referenced, but Hulk disagreed. He said that going back into the past can't change the future. Instead, it creates a whole new branch of time in which the present is now your past, and the new past you've gone back to is your present. You can't now change the future, which is your new past. Anybody still following? Thor not. You can see where the writers were trying to go with this, but the explanation from Dr. Banner just wasn't a very good one. There must have been a better way to portray the rules of time travel in the MCU, but what was the point when they were only going to be broken anyway? Number 1. Cap's ending in Avengers Endgame. When Bruce Banner bargained with the Ancient One for the Time Stone, he agreed to go back in time and put each stone back where they were picked up from by the respective Avengers. The logic of this was questionable at best anyway, given what Bruce had already said about not being able to change the future, but it would eventually lead to even more questions and confusion. After Thanos was defeated, Steve Rogers was sent into the past with Mjolnir and the Infinity Stones to return them. Again, never mind how he traded the Soul Stone back to the Red Skull or inserted the ether back into Jane Foster. The most confusing element of the scene was when he returned. He didn't come back through the portal as expected. Instead, he decided to live his life with Peggy in the past and then meet up with Sam at the exact same time in the future. Had he just been waiting on that bench the entire time and no one noticed him? And how did he even get back to this particular timeline? Based on Banner's time travel rules, Steve should have kick-started a new timeline separate to the one he left when he went back. So how then was he able to return to the same timeline he had always been on as an old man? Of all the confusing moments in Endgame, this was arguably the worst. And that concludes our list. If you can think of any other examples, then do let us know in the comments below. And while you're there, don't forget to like and subscribe and tap that notification bell. Also, head over to Twitter and follow us there, and I can be found across various social medias just by searching Ellie Littlechild. I've been Ellie with What Culture. I hope you have a magical day, and I'll see you real soon.